talk about whether comparing the tactics that the police used, that Mike has documented here, that with the tactics that were used in Seattle, say, right. That's where they learned to do it this way.
Actually, you can chart it back about 3 years earlier than Seattle. The model of security strategy that was rolled out in Seattle was actually developed for the 1996 Democratic Convention in Chicago. Reasons being pretty obvious, it was the first time a Democratic convention had returned to Chicago since 1968. These were tactics that were developed by Bill Clinton. They were not something that was developed by George Bush. They'd been around for quite a bit. And they involved massive security containment and deterrence. They involved the rollout of the riot police, the use of tear gas, the use of concussion grenades, mace, pepper spray, sweep nets, and all of these wonderful, wonderful toys that our security establishment has at their disposal these days.
Now, Charles, were you aware of any instances of using, for example, tear gas or pepper spray or any of these other, like that you just mentioned?
In New York City?
In New York?
Yes. On Monday, there were 2 marches that were billed as poor people's marches. And how ironic that when the poor people come out to complain, the violence starts. But there was an early morning march of the Still We Rise coalition, and that took place on the west side. And then at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, in front of the United Nations, there was an international poor persons march that was to go down 2nd Avenue. They started up at the UN, which is in the 50s, and it was a non-permanent march, but it was full of a lot of disabled folks in wheelchairs, old people, people who traveled from all around the world to protest global poverty. And once again, the police said, you'll be fine if you just march down the street, if you don't, or march down the sidewalk, don't obstruct anything, everything will be great. By the time they got to 23rd Street and 2nd Avenue, there were reports, which have been substantiated subsequently, of plainclothes police officers on mopeds driving into the crowd, knocking people into the street in order to arrest them. At one point in time, after a certain police officer had rammed into a certain crowd enough times, one person turned around and slugged them. And the police used this as a kind of entrance to call out the cavalry. And they brought in massive amounts of reinforcement. They tear gassed the crowd. They pepper sprayed a lot of people. They pulled out the orange netting, and they just scooped up anybody inside of it.
Right. So what happened here was minus all that violence, but I don't was the what happened to the people. Where the story goes from here is that now Mike was detained for 43 hours without your Miranda rights?
Without my rights being read to me, without the ability to talk to a lawyer, and clearly without the due process of 24 hours, which is by, I believe, New York statute required.
Yes, that's correct, Mike. Actually, Mike and I were cellmates for a while, and we both spent the bulk of 48 hours locked up. And we did not get to see a judge, and we did not even get to make a phone call until after about 28 hours. And New York statute does dictate that you have to see a judge within 24 hours.
Right. Now, just to finish up on the last topic, were people similarly denied counsel or read their charges in the Seattle instance?
In Seattle, it was a bit of a different circumstance. There weren't as many people as there were in New York City. Mm-hmm. I think the maximum amount of people in the street in Seattle was probably about 50,000. And the bulk of the violence, although the mainstream media and now subsequently historical lore has always shown that there was quote-unquote anarchist violence going on there, actually the bulk of the violence was done by the police. And the police were deployed in Seattle to take the protesters, and what isn't reported in the mainstream press is that most of the delegates to developing nations, trade representatives, that were supporting some of the poorest nations in the world were locked out of the conference rooms where decisions about what their nation's trade policies were going to be were being made for them. And so they were standing outside pounding on the doors, and they communicated out to the folks in Indie Media and Democracy Now! We're not allowed to come in and debate and discuss our own country's trade policies. It was at that point in time when the rally started to get a lot larger, and Seattle called out the riot police and started to clear the street using tear gas, rubber bullets, bean bags, and all of the usual tricks.
Right. But I think that in focusing back on the topic of this particular protest and any comparison between the two, was there a similar detention at the end as a result for the people who were arrested in these other?
Yes, to my understanding, there was detention, and there were also a lot of preemptive arrests made of organizers. They were held in a similar type of pen situation, although, from what I understand, the conditions on that detention center were not as deplorable as those on Pier 57.
Right. So let's. What were the conditions like in Pier 57?
Well, here, let me draw a portrait for you. Pier 57 is about the size of a football field. On the perimeter, in the exterior, it was surrounded by chain link razor wire fence, which was drilled right into the street outside. There was a dual fenced gate through which the transport buses would pull in and deposit prisoners into a long chute where they would be checked in one by one through metal detectors with their arresting officer. Pier 57 had been an old bus depot. There was, understandably, about 30 years worth of oil, transmission fluid, gasoline, antifreeze, chemical solvents on the floor. It was so thick that when you stepped on it, your shoe made an imprint on the floor. There had been a fire there, and there were still remnants of the fire up in the windows. Of course, all of them were sealed, so there was no air flowing through the place. There was asbestos dropping off the ceiling in chunks and clouds. And very quickly it became filled to capacity, beyond capacity, so that whatever temporary bathroom facilities that were there, they were very quickly filled up, and you can only imagine the stench that was coming from the place.
How many bathrooms?
There was no room for anybody to lay down or to sit down, so people were forced to go on the floor, which very quickly filled them with, people were coated from head to toe in a black sludge. And after a while, it started creating skin irritation problems and rashes and burns. I've got some myself on both of my forearms. People, their clothes were just caked in this black sludge. The air was stifling. It was really horrible.
Talk about the food.
Well, the food, okay.